Flesh and Blood's Living Legend system serves as its primary method of rotation. As more and more heroes have been reaching LL status, the system itself has come under discussion by the community. It's a bit of a hot topic over the last few months, mostly because it, of course, ignites the age-old battle in TCGs of rotation versus balance versus bans versus creep. So today I'm joined by none other than the lead designer for Flesh and Blood, Bryan Gottlieb, to chat Living Legend and how the system impacts his design approach. A huge shout out to our channel members for supporting what we do here. If you want to get involved with the channel and the Dice Commando community, please consider joining as a channel member. Remember, these videos are only possible with your support. You can show that support with a like, a subscribe, and by leaving us a comment and sharing your feedback. Community first, and go Commando. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Dice Commando and a very, very special Go Again, a Fabulous cast. Today we're discussing the Living Legend system in Flesh and Blood, and joining me today for the discussion is none other than lead designer for Flesh and Blood, Bryan Gottlieb. He can offer us a truly unique perspective on the LL system, not just in terms of function and rotation, but also in terms of how the LL system impacts overall design approach and the management of the game's competitive formats. Welcome, sir. How are we doing?
I'm doing fantastic, and it is a pleasure to be here on your channel. Myself and many other folks at LSS, big fans of your work, and just appreciate everything you do for our community and all the beautiful nuance and interesting takes you bring to the table.
Well, that is certainly appreciated to hear, and I look forward to meeting all of you in person in January at the Celebrationals. That'll be
absolutely.
All right, so first question I have for you before we get into the whole discussion is, 99% of the folks who are watching this have Flesh and Blood as their hobby, right? Something that enhances their lives, but not necessarily the main thing in their life. But for you, it's not just a passion, but it's also your career. So what does someone like you do for fun?
Play more Flesh and Blood. That is the primary thing. There are other aspects to my life. Sometimes I feel like I love Flesh and Blood so much that I have to actually sort of shoehorn them in, because the truth is, I love what I do. I love working on everything I work on, and it is often hard for me to be like, all right, just stop working for a bit, do something else, because I want to be working, not because there's any demands being placed on me. I just enjoy making Flesh and Blood cards and enjoy associating with the game. I enjoy going to my local armories, so there's still a ton of more casual Flesh and Blood in my life, despite the fact that it is my job. But besides that, I'm just a huge gamer in all aspects. I play a ton of video games. A lot of Teamfight Tactics is a game I engage with a lot from Riot. I still play not really other card games anymore. The luster has kind of disappeared for me. I love Flesh and Blood too much. If I'm playing a card game, I want to be doing that. But certainly, all the AAA games that come out, the Baldur's Gates, what else am I playing right now? Some Armored Core, just the typical video games you would expect. And then music is another big passion of mine. I have a bunch of synthesizers, and maybe you see my guitars floating over my shoulder there. And I love making music, listening to music, playing music, all that good stuff.
Is that all you play? Is like guitar? You play anything else? Or
I play pretty much any stringed instrument. So guitar, bass, can dabble in things like violin, mandolin. Play some piano, mostly play more synthesizers though than piano. I tried learning like the more classical piano style, and it's one of those things that I regret not picking up when I was younger. I certainly had like some competency and I enjoyed it, but I think as a really competitive person, it's hard for me to engage with things that I don't feel like I can be exceptional at. And when I just reach that wall and I'm like, well, I'm always going to be very mediocre at this thing, I often lose some of that excitement and that passion. But with synthesis, it's a little different, where a lot of the joy is in the creation of the sounds and manipulating waveforms to get cool things to come out, and less in the technical artistry and more in the composition. So I think synthesis has appealed to me a little bit more than classic piano.
So you like to create things. I wonder how that fits into our conversation.
Yeah, it turns out that is where my passions lie, for sure.
Fair enough. All right, well, let's hop into today's topic, right? So Flesh and Blood's Living Legend system is obviously a bit of a hot topic right now, and rightly so, with a lot of folks going down since August-ish, and then obviously Blitz happening as we're shooting this. We should expect to see the season or the week 3 postings probably within, I don't know, 12 hours, something like that, right? So in this conversation, right, a lot of time it boils down to a long-term argument of rotation versus no rotation in TCGs, right? And now, in full disclosure to yourself and the others out there, I am personally a pro-rotation person. That said, I certainly understand the other side of the coin and why others certainly might not be, right? So I do want to, for the folks viewing, right, that sets the ground rules, I think, for our discussion around this topic, that we have to understand that there are two sides, both with their own valid points, to a very complex argument like this one. So in Flesh and Blood, it's very unique in terms of how the heroes actually bring the archetype, so to speak, to the game, right? And when one of them rotates via the LL format, in many aspects, they can actually take that archetype with them. Right. So you compare that to a game like Magic, right, where you always have, say, red aggro, even though you may lose pieces from red aggro, you can still play red aggro. Or blue always be in control, right, whatever it may be, right? But when Dorinthea goes away, you might lose the Dawnblade playstyle, whatever. So how has that aspect really shaped your overall design approach for Flesh and Blood?
It's an interesting take. I think one of the things that is really important when you're talking about engaging with the living legend system and how it's going to impact the game presently, the game going forward. You have to realize how young this game is in terms of the influence of the living legend system on it. Certainly, there was the Starvo thing where there's just this hero catapulted into living legend status. But when it comes to CC, I think we're only now getting to the place where the living legend system is an active, fluid, continual participant in how the game works. And with that influence being exerted on the game, the design goals also change around that. With the knowledge that, the system has come to fruition, it is now working as intended. I do think you see us building more depth into archetypes.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that is, again, just starting to happen. And I'm not going to bring heavy hitter spoilers to the table today, but I think you will see that really come to fruition with heavy hitters as we start to build out some depth around classes. And I think that's a really important thing. And it's also an important thing. And I don't want to skip ahead, so stop me if you want to get into this later. But it's an important thing when you talk about how the living legend system is influencing talented heroes in particular. Talented heroes, almost by design, have less depth to their pool, to their influence, and they're sort of designed as this hotshot thing where, yes, there is the one elemental guardian, the one elemental runeblade that exists at the moment. When that hero is done exerting its influence on the game, it will pass on, likely come back in the future, as we saw with Prism, Vincent, those specific class talent combinations returned, but it's not meant to be omnipresent.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas things like classes are very much meant to be omnipresent. And, when one ranger leaves, well, here's Azalea going and winning the Realm Rumble. So yes, Lexi passed on, but Azalea is at the ready. And yes, the archetype is different. It plays in a different fashion. But some of those core elements are meant to carry over more and more. And as we build more depth into the class pool, specifically the class pool, and there are more rangers, there are more warriors, there are more ninjas, I think there will be a more fluid passing of the baton. Again, not precisely across archetypes, but certainly across cards being used, available strategies if you want to go, off meta a bit and, build a go wide Azalea deck. Things like that should be available to you. And I think you are only seeing the beginning of that happening. And I understand where the trepidation comes from the community, where they go, well, I'm just going to not be able to play Rangers anymore. No, that's not our goal. You will have a safe home. You will have a way to engage with this. And it may be different from what you saw before. But I do think it is important that we start setting up this dichotomy of talented heroes versus non-talented heroes and understanding that they're going to interact with the living legend system in very different ways.
That's very, very interesting, actually. So, and by a one shot, you mean like a temporary, not that they wouldn't be replaceable or reusable, or we wouldn't see something like that in the future, just that they're more of a temporary type thing within the overall meta. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, it is. It often, when we're designing these talented heroes, they engage in very specific ways. Their talent shapes them, and it's not the same as just accessing the entire warrior card pool or the
Mm-hmm.
entire illusionist card pool. It is pointed very much towards those elemental influences or the light shadow influences. Those have a huge impact on how these heroes are put together. And thus far, when we are designing those sets, we have not built out multiple heroes within a class, unlike something like, say, Outsiders, where we did have two ninjas, two rangers, two assassins. So it just stands to reason that when you only produce one hero at a time and that hero disappears, they're kind of a temporary fixture. And again, we cycle through, we bring them back. We've talked a lot about our desire to do so. There's always the intention to do so. One thing I think that maybe there's a lot of assumption around is sort of the time frame for doing that. I don't think it has to be an immediate replacement when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
talented heroes. I think there is some good that comes with time off, especially in the case of something like ice. Ice very polarizing mechanic amongst the flesh and blood community. I think it's good to have a little time away from ice, and then we'll come back to ice for sure in the future. Ice is not gone from the game forever. But let's take a little time. Let's reflect on it. Let's understood what worked about it, what didn't, and let's bring it back in a way that is new, novel, unique, and when people are ready for it as well and excited about the return of ice to the game.
Yeah, yeah, definitely with ice, because so far is every elemental hero's gone now, right?
Yes,
Yep.
all of Tales of Aria is now gone from CC,
Yep.
and interesting spot for our game to be in. It was obviously Tales of Aria. The first set I really engaged with from a competitive standpoint. I have a huge amount of affinity for that set, but I do think a lot of people were ready for a break from
Mm-hmm.
the elemental influence over the game, and we'll have that break now. And it'll be interesting to see how people react to that. But again, I do think it comes back to the idea of uh, having this kind of safe outlet for your class loyalty when it comes to engaging with the class instead of talent. I think people should feel very good about saying, I'm a warrior main. And you alluded to this in your most recent video, and I thought you did so in a very smart way. And I'm not going to say that is like the intended vision where we expect players to go ahead and engage as class mains, but I think that's a very successful way to engage with the game, and I think it's going to yield a lot of fruit for folks who are trying to have that more uh, like relationship like experience with the game where you really do form this bond with a hero and a class over a long period of time rather than just chasing the best deck in the meta, which by the way is also a totally acceptable way to engage with the game. It's how I before I was working on the game engage with the game, figure out the best deck, play the best deck, and be ready to play absolutely everything. And I didn't really have those kind of class loyalties. That's changed for me as my relationship with the game has changed, and I do feel more attachment to particular classes. But I think we have to remember, as it comes down to with all these sort of large scale design decisions and small design decisions, people want very different things. They want to engage with the game in very different ways, and you're often servicing two audiences at the same time. So it is important to have kind of these hotshot meta decks that
Mm-hmm.
have their quick run and are isolated in a talent class combination. And it's also good to have these long term class relationships as well.
Yeah, so I think that's a great lead into to our next one, right? So one of the potential challenges of the LL format is that point accumulation is cumulative, right? So eventually, whether it's 5 months or 5 years, your hero will living legend, right? It will happen. So in a game that doesn't have a core set of sorts, right, an evergreen card pool, have you considered, or has there been any talk about evergreen heroes, aka ones that are exempt from living legend status? And I would throw out there like maybe the WTR heroes are evergreen or something like that. Is that practical? What are your feelings on that in terms of game management?
It's interesting, and like I don't know that it's been like a focused effort of the design and development team to be like, well, what happened if this was the way we approached it? But it's been broadly discussed and contemplated, and particularly as it relates to a hero like Ira.
Hmm.
I think that it's actually the most compelling case for should a hero just be evergreen and
Hmm.
never go, because obviously a lot of the learn to play architecture around Flesh and Blood is based around Ira. Ultimately, I do think we're going to see Ira probably living legend this week
Hmm.
from Blitz, is my expectation. So we did decide to just go ahead and let things proceed naturally, but there was some discussion around that, and I see the appeal of it. Again, I know this is kind of a frustrating answer because you often just want like, no, this is the correct way to do it, and this is why we do it this way. Consider both sides, and there's merits to having this safe space, this hero that people can always return to. But I think so much of the joy in TCGs is wrapped in this constant evolution. I know when I first found TCGs back in the Stone Age, 1994, when I started playing these games, it uh the thing that appealed to me more than anything else, and to give younger viewers context, I am now going to shift fully into old man yelling at clouds mode. But in 1994, you purchased a video game, and that was a block you held in your hand that was forever that video game and did not change or evolve in any way. It was
Hmm.
just this static thing that you can engage with and enjoy. And a huge portion of what was mind blowing to me when I first started engaging with TCGs was like, oh, this game always changes. There's never any constants in it. There's rotations, there's new cards, there's power creep, there's just things changing all the time. And it makes for this dynamic experience. And you always are kind of on your feet. Sometimes you're comfortable, sometimes you're uncomfortable. And that was a huge percentage of the joy of TCGs for me. And I think it is important that we find a rotation system that is respectful of people's collections, investment into the game, but does offer that constantly evolving thing. And you talk about, no sort of core set pool. I would argue we have the biggest core set pool of any TCG I've ever seen, because the cards don't change. The cards are
Well,
still
that, yeah.
there. And I understand, like, yes, they are going to have varying degrees of application. But again, keep in mind, very young system we're engaging with. So yes, you lose these cards, that were good in, we'll just pick a random example, Oldhim. So now these cards don't have any purpose, and they're not really doing anything. But the next elemental guardian comes along and it reinvigorates this portion of your collection, and these cards are reactivated again. Even things just like in the core guardian pool, right? We make a new elemental guardian that engages in a very different way, and now you've had these WTR cards that you've never had a home for. They just never really fit competitively. But this new Guardian engages those cards. And I think that is actually the most exciting thing about the Flesh and Blood rotation, is that yes, there are moments when portions of your collections are yet less useful, but they can always be reactivated in the future. We're very cognizant about power creep. We're trying not to just invalidate these older cards. We're trying to preserve future homes for them. And the thing too is that we are playing such a long game here. Like, we have visions for Flesh and Blood to last 15, 20, 30 years. That is what we want this game to do, and we believe it can do that. So maybe that is asking for a lot from our player base to say, hold on to your cards for 10 years and then they'll be good. That's a huge ask. I absolutely recognize that. But can you imagine how good it's going to feel for the folks who did that, who had that buy-in forever, and then they get to go back into their 10-year-old collection and reactivate these cards they haven't really had a chance to play with? It's a really exciting proposition, and I think the payoff for the folks who stay invested for the long term is going to be massive in this TCG in a way that the industry has really never seen, because we have been engaging with this goal of longevity and playing the long game, and bringing things back around. And say a beloved hero, again, I'm picking at random. Let's say Dorinthea leaves the game, and we
No,
know
no.
we know how much people love Dorinthea, right? Beloved hero, but it CC's out, and for whatever reason, the time is not really right for Dorinthea to return, and we can't find the right home for it, and it's not fitting. And then, like 10 years down the road, Dorinthea comes back, and you've been invested all this time in this TCG. You still love it. You're still passionate about it. And after 10 years, your hero returns. Can you imagine how impactful that is as a long-standing fan of Flesh and Blood? The potential is massive to have these kind of payoffs in our game. And I don't want Dorinthea fans to panic. I'm not saying that's going to be the case. But something like that is very appealing to me.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, and you're right. You're right about the core set. That was probably a misnomer. I more meant the fundamental heroes, but yes, you are more correct than I am on that one. Right. So kind of my
But I
next.
think that's a
Oh,
very
go ahead.
reasonable. It's a very reasonable way of thinking about it. Like it is often mentioned as this huge rotation. Oh, the game's in upheaval and everything's changing, and it is. I'm empathetic to that. There's a lot of sudden change, and a lot of that is sort of just weird timing things. A lot of it is a very very dramatically accelerated point in flux based on really the frequency of skirmish seasons. There's just not going to be a lot of points put into the system over the next 8 months, and things have been static for quite a long time in Blitz until this most recent season. So it was a very tumultuous season, based mostly on timing. But I get the sort of turpitude that happens around these type of dramatic changes, and I just want to point out there is a lot of stability actually in the core Living Legend system that sometimes we forget about when we're just talking about it in terms of heroes.
Fair enough. All right. So kind of my next iteration on design space within the LL format, or maybe vice versa, I suppose, is the weapons, right? So with a large percentage of the weapons being, maybe not even a large percentage anymore, but some percentage of the weapons being tied to heroes, when that hero LLs the weapons LL, right? And again, you have that inevitability portion to it. So as a designer, I can see how you might be anxious for, or maybe not anxious, but maybe excited for doing a new spin on the Kodachis or a new spin on an Othos or whatever it might be. But one certainly can see the fundamental impact, let's say, to the game from that weapon leaving, right? I referenced the Kodachis, right? What does the ninja class look like without the Kodachis, right? So how do you plan to approach the ascension of weapons like that? We have a good example going on right now of with new Kassai coming out in heavy hitters and the Cintauri Sabers being legal in one and not the other. How does that play into your overall design approach?
Yeah, I will just say that as someone who loves playing Flesh and Blood and building Flesh and Blood decks, I can even speak about this outside the design experience. I'm just really interested. I'm excited. I don't know exactly what Ninja looks like if they don't have access to Kodachi. It's a really interesting question. Um, and I think it's exactly that type of uncertain experience that I mentioned as being key to my TCG experience. Like I want to explore that world. I want to have this restriction placed upon me. And now we can loop it back to design. If you've watched any interviews I do on the topic of design, I always sing the praises of Mark Rosewater. I feel like not only did he teach myself, James, basically every person I know working in the TCG design industry so much of the fundamentals, but a lot of like his mantras have fundamentally reshaped the way I approach the world. And the one that rings more true to me maybe than any is restrictions breed creativity. And if you've followed Mark's work, you've heard him say that many, many times. So when the ninja class is restricted uh, in their access to Kodachis, what do? How does their deck building change? What cards that are sitting out there dormant from WTR, again, going back to that like everlasting card pool, what cards all of a sudden have new purpose and do something very different than they did before? And I think that's a fascinating question. And the most important thing I think to do as a designer is to present players with intriguing, interesting questions over and over. Now, those may be gameplay questions, they may be deck building questions, they may be speculative questions. What's going to happen next? What's going to be banned in this next announcement? Like those type of things. The conversation, the engagement, it's critical to how we just plug into a TCG. So I want to be presenting those questions to the player base all the time. And I think the weapon question is another interesting one. And you're right. They do feel so fundamental to the experience sometimes, but sometimes you got to shake up those fundamentals to do something new, to do something exciting. And there's so many things you can point through throughout the history of Flesh and Blood that were a shake up to the fundamentals, and there'll be so many more. The introduction of talents was a huge shake up
Mm-hmm.
to the fundamentals. Dual class cards in Outsiders, huge shake up to fundamentals. There'll be more and more things like that as we go on, and I think it's just good to keep an open mind and understand that the game will always be evolving, while we are always cognizant of staying true to our roots.
Yeah, fair enough. Maybe Edge of Autumn becomes the new thing, huh?
Maybe. Or maybe we make a new weapon that totally,
Right.
redefines how ninjas want to play the game. I think the possibilities are kind of endless. And we've got a lot more tools available to us now with things like the expansion slot as well, and in terms of how we're going to sort of directly engage with the game. So, if we get to the scenario where Kodachis are gone and you see the ninja class is really struggling, you make something new. You find a new way to let ninjas interact, or you bring back Kodachis. Like I don't think anything has to be forever. There's always options to revisit things, and if something is not working and it becomes clear that we've made a grave mistake, and there is actually no room for adaptation, the ninja class is actually Kodachis. Again, not saying any of this is true, but just a hypothetical situation. You can always revert. We can always change things. We can always, sort of reprint those weapons into the fold. And I think that's what keeps it exciting, is just keeping all those options open.
Hmm. Yeah, so I actually like that point. And that kind of, I think, feeds back to my core heroes, let's call it that, right? It almost helps you, or could potentially help you with power creep in the future, right? Where let's say, Katsu, he's always been there, he does good things, but he's not super high in LL. And let's say you release some card and he immediately shoots to like 1500. That should serve as a check and balance, at least in theory, that maybe you push something too far, or, right? I'm just shooting from the hip here, right? But
No, it's a great learning tool. Like I think it is invaluable to have that check-in system, and certainly Starvo. You could say, what do we do wrong there? There's clear mistakes being made. I kind of die on the hill that I think Starvo was actually a net positive for the game. I think Starvo brought a lot of good stuff to the table, uh, and it's not always a disaster to have a hotshot hero like that just turbos its way to living legend. Especially as Starvo was released, it didn't strand any aspects of the card pool. It let a lot of new players engage with the game in a way that they got to play the casino a little bit. They got to have those powerful moments. They got to succeed in spots where we all know as a new Flesh and Blood player, it's really hard to find your first few wins to understand exactly what you're supposed to be doing. And Starvo simplified things a little bit, so a lot of good came from that hero. But yeah, there was a lot of lessons too. And when we saw that hotshot, obviously reflected a lot on what Starvo did. And I think the scenario you're envisioning, where we produce something that hotshots a hero like Katsu, there'll be a lot to learn from that as well.
Mhm. All right, so quick question for you on LL points, and maybe it's not a quick question, to be fair, but on LL points balancing.
Few questions are with me, honestly. Like I tend to be very loquacious. So.
I more meant in my setup, because I'm not always the most succinct, right? But so if we look back in 2022, there were 5,932 LL points awarded. And this year, there have been roughly 7,300. I know there's still some battle hardens to float out through the end of the year. But we added 7 new legal heroes this year, right? So at the overall balance, that's more points than we saw heroes, right? Now, I think the assumption out there, and I think James has mentioned 15 heroes. Is that the correct number that I'm hearing?
I don't know the correct number offhand.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
But it's been implied, at least, that with the points ramp we saw in the last update, that we're going to get more heroes.
There'll be more heroes. Yes, 100%.
Yeah. So in terms of balancing, what is your approach going forward? I mean, do you really look at it as if I have 20,000 points this year, let's say 3 years in the future, we're doing 20,000 LL points. Would we expect to see 20 heroes, or how do you manage that? Do we have to deramp? What's your take?
Yeah, it's not quite like a 1-to-1. You put in LL points equal to the number of heroes, but that influences the decision. And you just have to think about it in terms of, again, playing the long game and simple prolonged outcomes. So say we start introducing 15 heroes a year, and say the LL system puts in 11,000 LL points per year or whatever. Well, if we do that for 20 years, our CC hero roster is going to be plus 80 heroes over that span. And it just doesn't work out. Like, you do have to, if you feel that the size of CC in terms of the number of heroes that are present right now is correct. And I do think it is about correct. I think if it got larger, there could be some bloat. If it was smaller, it could be a little bit more limited. So the number of heroes in CC right now feels about correct to me. If you want to target that number of heroes, you do have to kind of adjust to how many heroes you're introducing. And we are going to be introducing more heroes going forward. A lot of that is just the new setup for our sets, the way we are doing just draftable set after draftable set, which, by the way, just keep folks updated, continues to be going very well. I suspect this will be the mode of set production for the foreseeable future, where you're just going to get the draft every time out, which we are very excited about, and it seems like our player base is very excited about. So we're very happy to continue delivering that. But it is going to lead to more heroes entering the pool, both in Blitz and CC. And I honestly think when it comes to Blitz, there were too few points being put in
Mhm.
for an extended period of time. And there was some bloat to the roster. And we needed to do some shifts to kind of trim off some of that bloat and get it back down to a manageable size. And I think that's what you're seeing in this skirmish season right now, where it's been kind of a bloodbath for heroes hitting LL. But, you know, you look at the heroes that are leaving, heroes that have been in the game for 3-4 years at this point, they had their time. They got to do their thing. And it is important those heroes move on and we get to this next phase of Blitz. And I think CC will have to have the same kind of upkeep done for it. And yes, to simply answer the question, LL points are related to the number of new heroes. There's going to be a lot more new adult heroes. We need more LL points to account for it.
But you wouldn't, or not you personally, but LSS wouldn't likely say let's do less events. You would just adjust the points per event, right? Would be the
I think
expectation
so.
there. Yeah.
I think, I mean, like the event experience is kind of just like provide as many events as makes sense to do so. Make sure people have a place to play skirmish. Make sure they have Pro Quest season and Road to National season that they want to engage with. So I think you build backwards. You create the OP system that you want people and make sure you have appropriate coverage for your player base. And then you adjust points based on that. And these points will continue to be adjusted. I think just the way this works is there are varying numbers of events that we will run every year. And we're not going to adjust those based on LL points. Instead, we'll just move the LL points to
Sure.
account for that.
Sure. Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. All right. So you already brought up Blitz, so let's go right there. For a long time, Blitz has been a 500 point as opposed to 1,000, right? Which is which is generally reflected less competitive events in Blitz. Blah blah blah. Right. It makes sense. Do you see a need in the future to perhaps like do a snapshot and rebalance and put that on 1,000, or do you plan on maintaining it at 500 and just because let's go back to skirmish season 7, right? In skirmish season 7, it was worth 1 point, right? Well, if that was it going forward, and then we added twice as many, in theory, you'd have to go to a half point. So do you rebalance on that, or do you think that 500 and higher turnover in Blitz is more appropriate?
Yeah, I like higher turnover in Blitz. I do think it is supposed to be a more rapidly evolving format.
Mm-hmm.
I think power imbalances in Blitz get reflected in results very quickly because the life totals, there's less wiggle room, less planning room. So if a hero's output is just better than other heroes, they tend to sort of skyrocket to the top of the LL charts. And we've done a good job managing that recently and finding a good power level for our Blitz heroes. But I think there's some really excited nouveau Blitz heroes that are about to have some real influence. Heroes like Emperor.
Mm-hmm.
Emperor really stands out to me as a hero that is poised to do some really exciting stuff. But in terms of the point limit, I just think with the frequency of Blitz points being injected into the system, and they're not coming from the Pro Tour scene, they're not coming from the calling scene for the most part. Occasional Blitz callings do happen, but tend to be more team events. And uh, even the Battle Hardened scene is still heavily weighted towards CC. So
Mm-hmm.
there just aren't that many opportunities to pick up Blitz points. And I think it is probably better that that threshold stays pretty low.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, it's all a balancing act, right? And maybe just to get the results you want, you do actually want to push to 1,000, and then you want to go to 3 points. There, you know, there's some fraction that makes sense in terms of balancing those two numbers where you are driven to use a higher threshold. If that's true, we'll do it. It's just a constant iterative process and trying to find that sweet spot. But I am pretty happy with the state of Blitz right now,
Mm-hmm.
honestly. It is a format that its devotees are huge supporters of. I love going to Blitz tournaments. My Blitz armories are the events I target in my calendar to go to precisely because of what Blitz is, because it is that fast-paced experience. Because when I go to my local Blitz armories, you know, I know people will bring everything under the sun and they'll go and they'll have fun and they'll play all kinds of different decks. And I know the tournament will wrap up in 2.5 hours. And with my busy schedule, that's really important to me. And I think, something about Flesh and Blood is the game does trend a little bit older, I think. A lot of folks with established careers, families, really busy lives that want that quick tournament experience to go ahead and plug in with. And Blitz is doing a good job filling that niche right now. And just what I see from Blitz players, there is not the same level of hero loyalty and hero mastery that I see in CC. They seem to be more comfortable with change, more comfortable with trying out a bunch of different decks. I know all of my local Blitz players, when you come to Armory, they bring like 3 or 4 decks with them, and they choose one almost at random. And if anyone else shows up and says, I want to try out this deck, they have it ready in their hand to the newest member of our community. And when someone new does show up for Blitz Night, they're offered 20 different decks to choose from. I just don't think there is a real accessibility problem when it comes to Blitz, and I don't think you really need to preserve that you need to be able to play this hero for 2 years, 3 years, and only play that hero. There's just a lot more like freewheeling expressiveness in Blitz, a lot more let's experience this style of gameplay. And I think that's something we should support with Blitz and just keep things moving, keep things flowing. So 500 feels about right to me right now.
Okay. Yeah, fair. Now, you had mentioned bloat, and as we apply bloat to Blitz specifically, because the UPF heroes like Genus and Melody are on that list, that doesn't count as bloat though, right? Because they're not really in the format. So I see people a lot that's like, well, there's 30 heroes legal in Blitz. That's not the right number, right? But there's so many heroes legal in Blitz. Like, well, but 10 of them don't count. So
10 of them don't count for now, is what I'll say.
I mean, that's fair. That's fair.
I think it is very reasonable that those heroes could count. I also think things like Professor Tech Levosson. Like I mentioned, I showed up to my local armory this past week. I brought 2 decks with me. I played Emperor just because that was ultimately where I decided. My other deck I had with me was Professor Tech Levosson. I think that is like a pretty real Blitz hero, despite being UPF coded. And I think there is a possibility to offer interesting play experiences. I'm sure you've seen like the Melody deck floating around, the Bard deck. I don't think it's very good yet, but it could be someday. So do they count in bloat? I could see an argument either way, honestly. I think it is just important that when you go as a newish player to a Blitz armory, I can't ask you to understand how 40 different heroes work. Like, that's just not a fair ask as a game designer to put on your players. You do need to know basics of how an opposing hero works. Like, you can go ahead and play your own game to some extent, but you should have some idea what your opponent is trying to do. If a hero such as Genus is showing up with just absolute near impossibility, like you're just not going to sit down against Genus all that often, I don't think he's actually contributing to the problem of bloat. While he may be there technically bloating the roster, the issue just comes when you're forced to prepare for, 25, 30 different viable decks. If there are inviable decks on that Living Legend roster, I think it's okay. And I understand that's a bit of a cop-out, but I just don't see a huge problem with those heroes sort of sitting at the bottom of the Living Legend ranks for Blitz, and maybe one day getting to do something really cool and becoming a great deck. I think the clearest example of that is something like Shiana, right? Where like, man, at some point Shiana is going to be the best deck in Blitz. Like, it is just going to happen. I am 100% aware of that because her card pool is going to be weird and ridiculous, and she's going to do things that no other hero can do. And that's going to be cool when that happens. And I don't know if I would say the same thing for Genus, but it's certainly within the realm of possibility. And I think that's part of the charm and allure of Blitz when those unique things start happening. It'd be very cool.
Yeah, fair enough. Actually, I've seen some pretty decent Shiana decks out there, right?
I believe it.
Alpha Rampage and was it the Kano specs? It's pretty good.
All kinds of good stuff out there.
Right. So, kind of a follow-up question there then. So, from a design standpoint, how have you really approached designing a card pool that can be used by 2 very different formats, right? I mean, you already alluded to the fact that obviously Blitz has less health, but the armor also has a heavier weighting in Blitz, right? So when you're designing a card, do you say CC first and then Blitz later, or do you design for both, or what's your approach?
We do design for both. I think it is indisputable that a higher percentage of our efforts are pointed towards CC.
Mhm.
Just the format that is played more, played for higher stakes. I think that's always going to be the case. But certainly, we're always thinking about things in a Blitz context. We adjust cards for Blitz, and sometimes you look at a card that doesn't quite hit in CC, and you go, "What were they thinking with this one? What? Obviously, this isn't good enough for CC." Sometimes that is Blitz exerting its influence, and it's just, if we had added that 1 point of power, becomes a Blitz powerhouse, and instead it has to settle for being a mediocre or sideways CC card, and that does happen. But I think that's a good thing. Again, it's one of those restrictions, breeding creativity type setups, and as long as I never feel like Blitz is preventing me from doing what I want to do in CC, I think it's a net positive thing. I don't feel that way about it, and part of that is you just have to accept the format as what it is. There's going to be blowout games. There's going to
Mhm.
be Rhinar killing you on turn one. That is absolutely going to happen. And when I sit down for a Blitz tournament, I'm cool with that. I accept that. I understand that. I embrace the variance. I applaud my opponent for blowing me up out of nowhere and getting the right combination of Rhinar cards to do so. And I move on to the next game, which is going to happen 20 minutes from now because that's the pace of Blitz. And it is very easy to just kind of move on to the next one and say, well, just not meant to be today. So as long as we're doing that, I think we're in a good place. And I also think the recent Blitz sideboard changes helped a lot with how much we can do in terms of pushing the power level of Blitz. Because when you allow for that adaptability, you can target the outliers a little bit more. And I think we did see that with the end of Kano's run. Like Kano was a real force throughout its time in Blitz, and it became, sort of a new player's bane. Like I heard a lot from players who were just finding their way in Flesh and Blood. They would show up to their local armory and just get annihilated by
Mhm.
Kanos week after week after week, and they found it very frustrating. And I think we, through adapting the format a little bit, got Kano to a place where he was able to be a more positive part of the metagame towards the end of his run. And the Blitz sideboarding changes were a huge part of that, and they will continue to have that influence over what we are able to do safely in Blitz, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, the data from Skirmish 7 was indisputable that the sideboard change did well toned him down or balanced him or whatever you want to say, but the data is very indisputable on that.
Yep.
All right, well, that's all the questions I had for you today. As we move kind of into closing this out, was there anything you wanted to chat about or any opens you had?
I'm basically here for the community, right? And you as a proxy for the community. So I want to know how folks are feeling about the Living Legend system. I want folks to know that we are aware that the pace of this Blitz season was quite hectic. A lot of heroes moving off the charts. I would not expect that to be the norm going forward. I think kind of like the 3 to 4 hero rotation target for a Blitz season is a nice place to be. But there were some real, not only heroes that were on the precipice of Living Legend, but power outliers too. I think the
Mm-hmm.
heroes we're seeing going right now are the absolute powerhouses of Blitz. And even if you move down to the next level of heroes, that might go. So we talked expecting Aria to probably go sometime soon. But I think like next up, heroes like Dash, Rhinar, those are the heroes that just kind of, again, blow you up, play a 2-turn game. I think those heroes are being worked out. I think once they're worked out, points will be distributed more evenly
Mm-hmm.
across a broad swath of the metagame. I think the pace of rotation will slow down just a little bit, and we should be a little bit more comfortable with it. And if this pace was too much for you, I am receptive to that feedback. I urge you to just ride it out. Understand that we have a long time till the next skirmish season. You're going to have about uh, I think it's about 8 months of just calm waters. Blitz is going to be the format it is for some extended period of time. You'll be able to engage with it with some consistency, and I hope everyone appreciates that and can appreciate the frequent shakeups as well.
Well, fair enough. Fair enough. And then we've got heavy hitters releasing in February. That'll give us
Can't wait, man.
a
Heavy
lot
heavy
more.
hitters is exciting. Yeah, I think folks who didn't quite find their home in bright lights. The mechanologist class didn't hit with them, and are more traditionalist and love the WTR adjacent type draft experiences, and of course those WTR classes. are really going to find a lot to love in heavy hitters. And the theme of this set is so cool. I think there's so much for people to fall in love with when it comes to heavy hitters.
Well, awesome. I'm super looking. I mean, many of my classes are in it, so I'm obviously biased, but I'm very excited. But to the bright lights point, I wasn't a huge mech person. I do have an OG Dash deck, but I really want to applaud you. I really like Dash IO or Database Dash. I really like that. I think it's really cool. It's super fun in Commoner, by the way. If you haven't tried it, it's super fun. So I think that hero was really well done. So to you or whomever else was involved in that, props on that one.
Great. I'm so stoked to hear that. And it is one the entire design team is really proud of. A really, really hard hero to get right.
Mm.
There was a lot of iterations around that hero that did not work, that were way too powerful, that just did things that were kind of uh, overwhelming to the game of Flesh and Blood. And it took a lot of work to get that hero into the sweet spot it is in now, and to see what it's doing in every format. And CC, what it ultimately did in Limited, how well it asserted itself as part of the trifecta in that format, and how much it really required players to unpack the puzzle and understand and engage. Like, I actually think the evolution of Bright Lights Limited is one of my proudest moments as a
Mm.
designer, because there was the perception upon early draft feedback that it was fatigue focused format, tech just force tech Leviathan and then block forever. And the way players trusted in our vision, stuck it out, kept plugging away, kept learning, kept finding ways to engage with the format, and really unlock the depth that we packed away in it. I'm so proud of what they were able to do with that limited format, and the joy I saw people having with it. It's such a cool thing to watch unpack over the weeks as we led in to Worlds, and then to watch Worlds and just the mastery of all three heroes that our best players displayed. It was really inspiring to see.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, before we get out of here, are there any thank yous you want to give or any shout outs you want to give? I mean, obviously, we know who you are and who you work for. So, but anything on your plate?
I got to give thanks to you one more time. I appreciate you creating this platform for me to come on and talk. I appreciate all you do for our community. I appreciate all of our players trusting in what we're trying to do here and believing that we always have your best interests at heart. We're always trying to make the best, the most exciting game possible, the game that we all want to play. And I do have these moments where I'm like, man, I wish I wasn't making this game so I could just be a flesh and blood grinder and travel around and play tournaments all the time. So I hope that we are delivering on our promises to all of our players out there, and I thank everyone for supporting what we do.
Awesome. Well, thank you for taking your time. For folks who are not aware, actually, kind of the fun story here was I contacted him, almost a month ago at this point, before we even knew about the changes to LL about this topic. And you kind of hit me back and you're like, hey, by the way, with this announcement that just came out, let's put a pin in this and circle back after World. So this has been a long time coming, but I'm really glad to finally get the opportunity to do this. And again, thank you for taking your time. And from me to you, have a great holiday season.
I appreciate it. You as well.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Make sure to leave comments, the likes, the subs, all that good stuff. And then, Brian, you got to say it with me, man. Go Commando.
Go Commando.